Greetings, my fellow citizens. I am James Madison, the fourth President of the United States, and today I invite you to walk with me through the chapters of my life. What I share with you is not just the story of one individual, but the story of a nation, our nation, that was forged through trial, compromise, and vision. I was born in the year 1751 in the heart of Virginia. My family was not of the grandest fortunes, but we held strong convictions, particularly in the value of education and the importance of liberty. I grew up in a world where the ideas of independence and self-governance were just beginning to take root, and these ideas would eventually shape my entire life. Like many of my generation, I witnessed the great struggle for independence. Our colonies, once subjects of the British Crown, had their own dreams of liberty and self-determination. But, as with all great struggles, the road was fraught with challenges. I was only a young man when the American Revolution began, yet it ignited a passion in me that would never fade. A passion for creating a country that would stand on the principles of freedom and justice. But my story is not just one of revolution. It is a story of creating something new. After the war, as we struggled to form a more perfect union, I knew our young republic could not survive under a weak, fragmented government. It was at this pivotal moment that I became involved in drafting the very framework of our government, the United States Constitution. I may not have been the only architect of the Constitution, but I believe my contributions, particularly in the Federalist Papers, helped to ensure that the rights of the people would be protected under a government that would be strong yet balanced. Perhaps you may ask, why my story now? Why does my life still matter? After all, I am but one of many who shaped this nation's birth. It is true, my name may not echo as loudly as that of George Washington or Thomas Jefferson. Yet, I firmly believe that my role in the creation of the Constitution, my work in securing the Union, and my time as president have played a quiet but crucial part in the story of our country. I was not just a witness to history, I was an active participant in it. My time as president was filled with tests of character and resolve. I faced foreign threats, both from Britain and France, and was forced to make decisions that would define the future of the United States. The War of 1812 was one of those moments where the very survival of our republic seemed at risk. But through perseverance, I believe that we could overcome these challenges, and together, we did. As I look back, I realize that my life has been one of change and adaptation. A man who came from a small estate in Virginia to serve as the leader of a nation in its formative years. My decisions were often difficult, but I always believed in the importance of securing the future of this nation. Not for me, not for any one person, but for the generations that would follow. So today, I ask you to join me as I recount the journey that has been my life. I will take you through my early years in Virginia, my education at Princeton, the struggles of the new republic, and the creation of our Constitution. You will hear of my time as president during the War of 1812 and how I navigated the challenges of leading a nation in its infancy. You will also hear of my quieter days after the presidency, when I retired to my estate in Montpelier to reflect on the legacy of the work we all had done. This is not merely a recounting of events. It is a reflection on the very principles that shaped us as a nation: freedom, democracy, and the pursuit of justice. I hope that, through my eyes, you will gain a deeper understanding of the sacrifices made, the risks taken, and the hope that drove all of us to build a better future for America. Let us begin, then, at the very beginning, with the day I was born, and follow the steps that would lead me, step by step, into the making of the United States of America. My name is James Madison, and I was born on March 16, 1751, in Albemarle County, Virginia. This land, though peaceful and quiet, became the setting for every chapter of my life. My family wasn't of noble birth, but we were blessed with a rich cultural heritage. My father, George Madison, was a plantation owner managing a large estate, while my mother, Nellie Conway Madison, came from a family of good education. From the earliest days of my life, my parents encouraged me to seek knowledge, particularly my father, who always believed that education and character were far more valuable than wealth and status. My father, George Madison, was a prosperous landowner in Virginia, though we were not among the richest families in the colony. But my father played a crucial role in shaping my character. Though he was a landowner, He cared deeply about the education of his family, especially mine. He believed that knowledge would bring wisdom, and wisdom would lead to true freedom. My mother, Nellie Conway Madison, was an educated and wise woman, and her influence on me was profound. She was gentle yet firm, always teaching me to see the world through a moral lens and to approach life with integrity. She taught me that the pursuit of knowledge should be lifelong and that the mind is our greatest asset. From a young age, I was fortunate to live in such an environment. My father often engaged in thoughtful discussions with me, not just about farming, but about the world beyond our fields. His conversations with me were full of reflections on the nature of society and governance. These discussions ignited within me a deep desire to understand the mechanics of political and social structures, even if I didn't yet understand the full implications of these ideas. I was not a healthy child. My body was frail, and illness seemed to be a constant companion. While other boys my age spent their days running through the fields, I often found myself confined to my room, unable to play or join in the physical activities that were the norm for most children. I was frequently bedridden, with doctors visiting our home regularly, attempting to ease my various ailments. Though my frailty kept me from physical exertion, it granted me the opportunity to delve deeply into books. My physical weakness became the very reason I turned to the world of ideas. I began reading voraciously, immersing myself in philosophy, history, and political theory. The books that lined our shelves were not just tools of education. They became windows into a broader world, a world that my frail body could not explore, but my mind could. Perhaps my body was weak, but my mind grew stronger. While others were engaged in sports or outdoor games, I was reading and learning, understanding more about the world and its intricacies than I could have through physical activity alone. At home, I was educated by private tutors who taught me Latin, Greek, mathematics, history, and classical philosophy. My mother, especially, played a pivotal role in my intellectual development. She instilled in me a deep appreciation for classical thought, and it was through her guidance that I first encountered the works of ancient philosophers like Plato, Aristotle, and Socrates. These teachings were not merely academic. They shaped how I began to think about governance, society, and individual rights. In addition to my mother's guidance, my father, though not directly involved in politics, often engaged me in debates about the state of Virginia and the broader political landscape of the colonies. These discussions were vital to my understanding of the political situation. My father believed strongly that one's civic duty wasn't just to tend to one's own affairs, but also to take responsibility for the future of the community and the nation. I remember one conversation where my father discussed the complexities of British rule over the colonies, and he said to me, "While we may have plenty of crops in the field, the true wealth of a nation cannot be measured by its material possessions alone." His words stuck with me, and they planted the seed of independence that would grow in me as the years passed. By the time I was 18, I knew that to fully understand the world, I had to step outside the confines of home. In 1771, I made my way to Princeton University, embarking on a new chapter of my life. Princeton was a very different experience from the quiet studies of home. The professors there challenged me in ways I had not experienced before. The curriculum was rigorous, and the academic atmosphere was one of intense intellectual stimulation. I found myself immersed in an environment where learning wasn't just about memorizing facts. It was about engaging critically with ideas, questioning established truths, and formulating one's own understanding of the world. It was here that I first encountered more formal political theory, especially the works of John Locke and Montesquieu, whose writings would later influence my own thoughts on governance and liberty. Though my health was still fragile, and I wasn't as physically active as my classmates, I remained dedicated to my studies. I often spent long hours in the library or my dormitory, reading and contemplating the ideas that would later shape my political views. It was at Princeton that I realized how much the world needed a government that was based on reason, justice, and the protection of individual freedoms. In 1771, at the age of 20, I left the familiar fields of Virginia and traveled to Princeton, a place where I hoped to deepen my education and better prepare myself for the challenges that lay ahead. The journey was a turning point in my life, for it was here that I would experience firsthand the academic rigor intellectual freedom, and moral debates that would shape my future work in both politics and governance. Princeton was a world apart from the relatively quiet life I had known at home. It was a place where young minds were not only encouraged to learn, but to challenge, question, and refine ideas. The professors were brilliant, but they did not simply lecture. They pushed us to think critically and independently. We were encouraged to dive deeply into subjects, to look beyond the surface, and to understand the true essence of the ideas we studied. I found myself in an environment where I was not only learning facts, but developing the tools to think analytically and logically. While I was still somewhat isolated by my frail health, I found that the intellectual environment at Princeton more than made up for this physical limitation. The academic demands were formidable, yet the university provided the space for me to immerse myself fully in my studies. I recall long nights spent poring over the works of Locke, Montesquieu, and Rousseau, philosophers whose ideas on the nature of liberty, government, and human rights resonated deeply with me. Perhaps more than any other subject, it was political philosophy that intrigued me most. The principles of liberty, the separation of powers, and the notion of a government designed not to rule over the people, but to protect their natural rights. All of these ideas began to crystallize in my mind. I began to see that the quest for liberty required more than a revolutionary act. It required the creation of a just and lasting system of governance. These thoughts became a driving force in my intellectual development. Princeton exposed me to a wealth of political philosophy, much of which was directly relevant to the struggles we faced as colonies under British rule. I studied John Locke's theories of natural rights, where he argued that life, liberty, and property are inalienable rights granted to every individual by virtue of their humanity. Montesquieu's idea of the separation of powers, which would later become the basis for the U.S. Constitution, struck me as a vital safeguard against tyranny. Rousseau's social contract theory, which proposed that legitimate political authority must derive from the consent of the governed, opened my eyes to the possibility of a new, more just political order. It was at Princeton that I first began to formulate the core of my political philosophy, the idea that liberty and justice must be protected by a system of government that is both powerful enough to maintain order and limited enough to ensure that individual freedoms are not infringed. The theories I encountered were no longer abstract concepts to me. They were the very tools I would use to shape the future of the United States. These ideas gave me a sense of direction, but they also deepened my sense of responsibility. I began to see that the American colonies were not merely rebelling against a foreign monarch. They were struggling to define the nature of their own government. I understood, perhaps more clearly than most, that the true challenge would be in creating a political system that balanced liberty with order, a government that was strong enough to maintain unity, but one that was not tyrannical in its power. One of the most valuable experiences at Princeton was the intellectual debates that occurred daily, both in the classroom and outside of it. We students often engaged in spirited discussions about the great political issues of the day. These debates helped me hone my own ideas and exposed me to a variety of perspectives. My peers, some of whom were just as passionate about liberty and governance as I was, pushed me to refine my thinking and to articulate my views with greater clarity. I recall many evenings spent in conversation with fellow students, debating the merits of independence, the role of the colonies in the world, and the best form of government for our fledgling republic. At times, we would become quite animated, each of us defending our positions with fervor. I realized that these debates were not just about intellectual engagement. They were about the future of our nation. Princeton also provided me with an opportunity to engage with ideas outside of my own comfort zone. While I was firmly rooted in the belief that liberty must be safeguarded, I was willing to listen to opposing viewpoints. This intellectual openness would later help me in my political career, as I came to understand that compromise and thoughtful dialogue are key to any functioning democracy. Though I was determined to succeed, my health continued to be a significant obstacle. At Princeton, my physical frailty became even more apparent. While most students could participate in the more active pursuits of university life, sports, physical activities, and social events, I remained largely confined to my studies. I was often too weak to participate in the physicality of university life, and this isolation gave me more time to think, to read, and to reflect. In many ways, my physical condition became a blessing in disguise. It allowed me to focus entirely on my academic pursuits and to develop a sense of intellectual resilience that would serve me throughout my life. I became accustomed to pushing through discomfort and dedicating myself to my studies, even when my body was not at its best. By the time I graduated from Princeton, my understanding of government and liberty had matured significantly. I left the university with a strong conviction that America needed not only to free itself from British rule, but to create a new form of government, one based on the principles of justice, equality, and the protection of individual rights. My education at Princeton had provided me with the intellectual tools to help build a nation that would stand as a beacon of freedom and democracy in the world. Princeton had not only prepared me academically, but it had also shaped my character. It had taught me to think critically, to question assumptions, and to recognize the importance of balance in all things. These lessons would prove invaluable as I moved into the political arena and began to work toward a more perfect union. In many ways, my time at Princeton marked the beginning of my political journey. It was there that I first saw the path ahead, not just for me, but for the nation I hoped to help shape. The intellectual fire I kindled at Princeton would burn brightly throughout my life and guide me as I took on the role of one of the framers of the United States Constitution. When I returned to Virginia in 1776, fresh from my studies at Princeton, the world I knew had shifted irrevocably. The Revolution had begun in earnest, and the events that followed forced me to confront not only my philosophical beliefs, but the realities of governing a newly independent nation. No longer was I a scholar poring over abstract theories. Now, I was a participant in a revolution, part of the fray, and it was clear that Virginia, like the rest of the colonies, was at a crossroads. The future of our republic hung in the balance. The revolution was not only a conflict with Britain, it was a war for the soul of America, and Virginia was deeply embroiled in this struggle. On one hand, there were those who saw the revolution as a way to achieve true freedom, to rid ourselves of British tyranny, and to create a just society founded on the principles of liberty and equality. On the other hand, many Virginians were more conservative. They feared that breaking away from Britain would lead to chaos, a loss of stability, and the disruption of their way of life. The aristocracy, in particular, was apprehensive about losing their privileged position. As I walked through the streets of Williamsburg and Richmond, it was evident that the old social order was cracking. The question was not simply whether we should seek independence from Britain. It was whether the ideals of liberty and equality could be applied to the complexities of Virginian society. While the revolution was framed as a fight for liberty, I could not ignore the glaring contradictions in our own society. How could we fight for freedom while allowing a system of slavery to persist? How could we claim to be advocates of liberty while denying it to so many of our fellow men? This moral dilemma, the tension between the ideals of the revolution and the reality of slavery, became the defining struggle of my early political life. I could not reconcile these two competing forces, and I knew that any new government we created would need to address these issues if we were to truly build a nation founded on freedom and justice. In Virginia, the issue of slavery was particularly fraught. While some Virginians began to question the institution, others, especially the large landowners, saw it as indispensable to the economy and social structure. Tobacco farming, which formed the backbone of Virginia's wealth, was dependent on slave labor, and the landowning elite were not ready to relinquish that economic foundation. It became clear to me that if Virginia, and indeed the new nation, was to build a government based on equality and justice, it would have to come to terms with the institution of slavery. Yet the reality was that the Southern economy and the political power of Virginia were deeply intertwined with it. This paradox would haunt the political debates of the early years of the Republic, and I struggled with the question of how to square the ideal of liberty with the institution that seemed to be the very antithesis of it. Meanwhile, the growing divide between the landholding aristocracy and the poorer classes, who had little to no say in the government, intensified the political turmoil. The wealthy elite in Virginia had long enjoyed political power, and they were unwilling to yield that power without a fight. On the other hand, many ordinary Virginians, especially the farmers and smallholders, saw the revolution as an opportunity to claim a greater share of power and representation. These competing interests created a volatile political climate, and I found myself caught in the middle, trying to navigate these tensions and form a coherent political vision for the future of Virginia. My involvement in Virginia's political struggles took a more direct form when I was called upon to participate in the drafting of the Virginia Constitution. This task was monumental. We were not simply creating a set of laws, but laying the groundwork for a new political system that would guide the future of our state and, by extension, the future of the nation. At the Virginia Convention, I found myself working alongside figures like Thomas Jefferson, who was pushing for radical change, and Patrick Henry, who was advocating for a more cautious approach. The debates were intense. The question was, how could we balance the need for a strong government with the protection of individual rights? How could we ensure that the power of the government was not abused, while also providing for the common good? The issue of representation was another difficult point of contention. The aristocracy favored a system in which political power was concentrated in the hands of the elite, while the common people demanded a more democratic system. I found myself arguing for a system that would reflect both the ideals of popular sovereignty and the necessity of checks and balances to prevent the rise of tyranny. It was in these debates that I first began to think deeply about the nature of government. I had learned from my studies at Princeton that a government must be based on the consent of the governed, but I also came to realize that the government must be structured in such a way that it would not fall into chaos or anarchy. My experience at the Virginia Convention helped to crystallize my thoughts on what would become my most enduring political principle: that the best government is one that is balanced and composed of various checks to ensure liberty and justice for all. While the debates in Virginia were important, it became increasingly clear to me that the system under the Articles of Confederation was inadequate. As we struggled to create a stable government in Virginia, I saw firsthand how ineffective the central government was in dealing with issues like commerce, interstate disputes, and national defense. The lack of a strong central authority meant that states were left to act independently, often to the detriment of the nation as a whole. The inadequacies of the Articles of Confederation led me to adopt a more federalist viewpoint. I came to believe that the United States needed a strong central government, one that could regulate commerce, ensure national security, and create a unified system of laws. But I also understood the importance of limiting the power of this government, ensuring that it could not infringe upon the rights of the people or the states. The government must be powerful enough to maintain order, but not so powerful as to infringe upon liberty. This evolving belief in a stronger central government eventually led me to Philadelphia in 1787, where I would join other leaders to craft the U.S. Constitution. But before that moment, I had to continue grappling with the many political struggles in Virginia, all of which would inform the decisions I would later make on the national stage. The political experience I gained in Virginia during these years was crucial to my development as a statesman. It was in Virginia that I first encountered the deep contradictions that would shape my later political philosophy. It was in Virginia that I learned the importance of compromise, of balancing competing interests, and of seeking pragmatic solutions in the face of deeply entrenched social divisions. Moreover, it was in Virginia that I began to see the deep flaws in the Articles of Confederation and how a more robust federal system could provide the stability and unity needed to secure the nation's future. The political turmoil in Virginia helped shape my views on federalism, and it became clear to me that the challenges facing the new republic required a system of government that was both strong and just, a government that could protect individual rights while ensuring the common good. In 1787, when I stepped into the halls of the Pennsylvania State House in Philadelphia, I knew the task before us was immense. The Articles of Confederation, though effective during the Revolutionary War, had proven inadequate in the face of the challenges a young nation must face. I believe that the solution to these problems lay in a strong federal government, one that could unify the states, provide for common defense, regulate commerce, and safeguard individual liberties. What we were about to create would shape the future of our nation and, in many ways, the world. The period following the American Revolution was one of uncertainty and chaos. The Articles of Confederation, ratified in 1781, had created a loose alliance of states, with a very weak central government. Although they had served us well during the Revolutionary War, These articles were insufficient to hold the newly independent states together. States acted like independent nations, with their own currency, tariffs, and laws. Economic chaos followed as states competed against one another, and the central government, unable to levy taxes or regulate interstate commerce, was powerless to intervene. The inability of the articles to address internal disputes, provide for the national defense, or even regulate trade led to serious consequences. This weakness became apparent when an economic recession hit in 1784, and the government was powerless to respond effectively. The Shays' Rebellion in 1786 further demonstrated the weakness of the Articles and served as a stark reminder that the fledgling United States was on the brink of collapse without a stronger, more unified government. I came to Philadelphia with the firm belief that the new government must be strong enough to avoid such chaos, but not so strong that it would lead to tyranny. We needed a system of government that could balance power, protect liberty, and maintain order. Upon arriving at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, I quickly realized that the difficulties we faced were far greater than I had anticipated. The convention was a gathering of highly divergent views. Some, like Alexander Hamilton, favored a strong, centralized government, even suggesting a presidential system that could last for life. Others, such as the delegates from smaller states, feared that a powerful central government would overshadow their interests. At the same time, we had to reckon with the geographical divisions that threatened to fracture the unity of our new nation. The northern states had an economy based largely on trade and manufacturing, while the southern states relied heavily on agriculture, particularly tobacco, and the institution of slavery. The economic and political interests of these regions were often at odds, and finding common ground would require patience, compromise, and a deep understanding of the principles of republican government. I found myself constantly balancing competing factions, working behind the scenes to mediate between differing views. The discussions were heated, but they were also a critical part of the process that would lead to the creation of our Constitution. My contributions, particularly the Virginia Plan, were aimed at establishing a government with the strength necessary to maintain order and protect the rights of the people. The central issue in the debates was representation. Larger states, like Virginia, favored a government with representation based on population, which would give them more power in the national legislature. Smaller states, fearing domination by the larger states, pushed for equal representation for all states, regardless of size. To address these concerns, I proposed the Virginia Plan, which called for a bicameral legislature with both houses based on population. The plan also called for a strong executive branch and an independent judiciary, marking a clear shift from the weak structure established under the Articles. Though the Virginia Plan was initially met with resistance, it laid the groundwork for a new government that could operate effectively at the national level. The debates on representation led to the Connecticut Compromise, which was critical in shaping the structure of our government. This compromise established a bicameral legislature, with the House of Representatives based on population and the Senate giving each state an equal voice. This was a crucial moment in the convention, as it allowed for a more balanced system that could satisfy the interests of both the large and small states. One of the most morally troubling issues we faced was slavery. The southern states, whose economies were heavily dependent on slave labor, were unwilling to consider any proposal that might threaten the institution of slavery. While many of us in the North were deeply opposed to slavery, we knew that alienating the southern states would doom the entire process of constitutional reform. In the end, we reached a painful compromise. The 3/5 compromise allowed states to count 3 out of every 5 slaves for the purposes of representation in Congress, which increased the political power of southern states. Additionally, the Constitution allowed the continuation of the slave trade for 20 more years before it could be abolished. Though I was deeply troubled by these compromises, I understood that without them, the southern states would never ratify the Constitution. This issue, which I could not resolve fully, would continue to haunt our nation and lead to the divisions that would erupt decades later in the Civil War. But in the moment, it was a bitter but necessary compromise. With the Constitution drafted, our next challenge was to secure its ratification by the states. Many Americans were wary of a strong central government, fearing it would infringe on their freedoms. The Anti-Federalists, led by figures like Patrick Henry and George Mason, argued that the proposed government was too powerful and lacked sufficient protections for individual rights. To address these concerns, I, along with Alexander Hamilton and John Jay, set out to convince the American public of the necessity of a strong central government. We wrote a series of essays, now known as the Federalist Papers, in which we explained the principles behind the Constitution, argued for the importance of a unified government, and reassured Americans that their rights would be protected under the new system. The Federalist Papers, which appeared in newspapers across the country, played a crucial role in shaping public opinion. We addressed the fears that the Constitution would lead to tyranny by emphasizing the system of checks and balances and the separation of powers. By showing how the Constitution would actually protect liberty, we were able to sway public opinion and build support for the new government. By June 1788, after months of intense debate and political maneuvering, the Constitution was ratified by the required 9 states, and the new government was born. The Constitution provided the framework for a government that could act with the strength necessary to ensure the security of the nation while protecting the rights of the people. In many ways, the Constitution was a product of compromise, a document forged from diverse viewpoints and interests. But it was also a testament to the political maturity of the framers, who understood that, while perfection was impossible, a balanced and flexible government could be created. The Constitution provided the framework for a new era in which the government could evolve, adapt, and endure. For me personally, the creation of the Constitution was the culmination of years of thought, debate, and struggle. It represented the principles I had long championed: a government based on the consent of the governed, the protection of individual rights, and the establishment of a republic in which power was separated and limited. When the War of 1812 came to an end, many expected peace and prosperity to follow swiftly. But I quickly learned that the challenges of governing were far from over. Our country, though victorious, was divided by differing visions for its future. Political factions, economic difficulties, and the pressure of external forces continued to plague the republic. My presidency was not just about defending the nation from abroad, but also about stabilizing it at home. After the Treaty of Ghent was signed and hostilities ended, I had hoped the political strife we experienced during the war would ease. But the reality was quite different. The Federalist Party, once dominant under the leadership of Alexander Hamilton and John Adams, had become a shadow of its former self. The party's opposition to the war, particularly their Hartford Convention in 1814, had led to accusations of treasonous behavior, weakening the Federalist position in national politics. While the war had left the nation's sense of unity stronger, the political climate was still volatile. My administration faced growing partisan divides. The Jeffersonian Republicans, led by figures like my ally James Monroe, were eager to expand the influence of the central government while holding onto Jefferson's ideal of an agrarian, decentralized republic. I found myself caught in the middle of this emerging battle between two conflicting visions for America's future. The political landscape was shifting, and despite my long-standing association with Republican values, I knew the country needed some form of consolidation to ensure stability in the coming decades. One of the most difficult decisions I faced during my presidency was the re-establishment of a national bank. The expiration of the first Bank of the United States had left the country without a central financial institution to stabilize the economy. The effects of the war had left the country economically crippled. Widespread inflation, national debt, and a lack of a unified currency undermined the financial system. Despite the necessity of a national bank, I faced opposition from many Republicans who feared that such an institution would create a centralized power that could undermine state authority. This was a recurring dilemma in my administration: how to support a strong federal government while maintaining the Jeffersonian ideal of limited government and states' rights. In 1816, I reluctantly supported the creation of the Second Bank of the United States, believing that it was crucial for economic stability. The bank's role in regulating the nation's finances, controlling inflation, and helping fund public works was undeniable. Yet, this decision deepened the political divisions, with many Republicans viewing it as a betrayal of the principles they had fought for during the Revolution. The debates over the national bank, along with other economic issues like protective tariffs and internal improvements, would would continue to fuel partisan tensions in the years after my presidency. Following the war, there was a growing movement among some of my political allies, most notably Henry Clay, to promote a policy of economic nationalism. This policy was designed to strengthen the economy through internal improvements, including a national road system, a protective tariff to encourage American manufacturing, and a national bank to regulate the economy. I was initially cautious about these proposals. My experiences during the war had made me acutely aware of the country's infrastructure weaknesses. However, the role of government in these ventures was a significant issue for me. It took time for me to embrace certain aspects of this economic vision, but I came to see the necessity of creating a more connected nation to support our growth. In 1816, the Congress passed a tariff aimed at protecting American industries, and the national road system began to take shape. This was the beginning of what would later be known as the American System, a set of economic policies that would foster the growth of industry and improve the country's infrastructure. I supported these measures in principle, but remained cautious about their long-term implications for federal power. Another challenge I faced was the growing tension in foreign affairs, particularly in relation to Latin America and European powers. As Europe entered the post-Napoleonic period, many of the colonial powers sought to reassert their influence over the Americas. The possibility of European intervention in Latin America threatened the stability of the newly independent nations there. Under the leadership of my Secretary of State, James Monroe, I supported a policy that would come to be known as the Monroe Doctrine, which warned European nations against further colonization in the Americas. This doctrine became a cornerstone of American foreign policy and helped to secure our position in the Western Hemisphere. At the same time, we had to balance our relations with Britain, which, although not actively hostile, remained a looming presence. While we were not yet a major world power, the Monroe Doctrine marked an important assertion of American influence and began to define our role in the global arena. Despite the successes in foreign policy and economic development, the era of good feelings, as it came to be known, was not without its internal political struggles. The absence of the Federalist Party left the Democratic-Republican Party as the dominant force in American politics. However, this dominance created its own challenges. Without significant opposition, our party's internal divisions became more pronounced, particularly over issues like the role of government, economic policy, and national expansion. During my presidency, there was a growing movement toward political factionalism. The Federalists had largely faded away, but new factions within the Republican Party were beginning to emerge. Figures like Henry Clay, John C. Calhoun, and John Quincy Adams would each advocate for different visions of the nation's future. This factionalism was not just about policy. It was also about competing ambitions for leadership. As my time in office came to an end, I could not help but see the rise of a new generation of leaders who would take the nation in different directions. The unity we had achieved during the war would soon give way to a more fragmented political environment. As I looked back on my presidency, I saw that while we had made great strides in ensuring the country's independence and economic viability, the path ahead would be full of challenges. The decisions I made regarding the national bank, internal improvements, and foreign policy were not just about managing the present. They were about setting the stage for the future. The Republic was growing and changing rapidly, and the challenges I faced, domestic and foreign, were just the beginning of the struggles that would define the coming generations. But in those difficult years, we had laid the groundwork for a strong and unified nation, one that would weather future storms and grow into the world power we had always hoped it could be. As I stood before Congress in June of 1812, asking for a declaration of war, I knew I was asking for something that would fundamentally change the course of American history. The decision was fraught with risk. Our country was still young, our military unprepared, and our economy fragile. Yet, the repeated violations of our maritime rights and the continued interference of foreign powers left us with little choice but to defend our sovereignty. This was a test not only of our national strength, but of our resolve to preserve the freedoms we had fought for during the Revolution. The causes of the war were multifaceted, but the most pressing issue was Britain's blatant disregard for our neutral rights on the high seas. American ships were being seized, and our sailors were forcibly impressed into British service. In the early years of the 19th century, the British Navy had become the dominant force on the seas, and they treated American ships as nothing more than targets. Our people were humiliated and our economy crippled by trade restrictions and seizures. Despite our diplomatic efforts, which included the Embargo Act of 1807, Britain and France continued to interfere with our rights. At the same time, Britain's support for Native American resistance on our western frontier compounded the issue. British agents, operating from Canada, encouraged Native American tribes to resist American expansion. These conflicts on the frontier were not isolated incidents. They were part of a broader British strategy to weaken American power. I had hoped to avoid war, but after years of diplomatic failure, I could no longer ignore the growing threat. I did not take the decision to declare war lightly, but I felt it was our duty to defend our sovereignty and stand against foreign oppression. The first year of the war revealed the stark reality of our military unpreparedness. We had no standing army to speak of, and our navy, though valiant, was far smaller than the British forces. Our initial attempts to invade Canada were disastrous. We underestimated the strength of the British and their Native American allies. The defeat at the Battle of Queenston Heights in 1812 was particularly painful. It was clear that we had overestimated our ability to fight a war on multiple fronts. In addition to our military shortcomings, we faced internal political opposition. Many in the Federalist-controlled New England states were vehemently opposed to the war, fearing economic disruption. Their opposition to the conflict was so strong that it culminated in the Hartford Convention of 1814, where some Federalist leaders discussed the possibility of New England seceding from the Union. This internal division weakened our efforts at home and made the war even more difficult to prosecute. Yet, even in the face of these challenges, I believed in the cause. I knew the war was necessary to assert our national independence and safeguard our rights. In 1814, after 2 years of grueling conflict, the British launched a decisive counteroffensive. In August of that year, British forces landed on the Chesapeake Bay and marched towards Washington, D.C. I remember the panic that spread through the city as the British approached. The capital, still in its infancy, was largely undefended. The decision to evacuate the city was made hastily. I left with my wife, Dolly, and many of our fellow officials as the British Army burned the White House, the Capitol, and several other key buildings. The destruction of Washington was a personal and national humiliation. To see our nation's seat of government engulfed in flames was a deep wound. But even as the city burned, I resolved that we would not be cowed by this defeat. The fire was symbolic of the challenges we faced, but it also strengthened the resolve of our people. Although our nation had suffered a blow, we could not allow it to define us. We would rebuild, and we would continue to fight. This was not the end of our fight for independence. It was merely another chapter in the struggle. After the British marched through Washington, they set their sights on Baltimore. Fort McHenry, which guarded the harbor, became the focal point of the defense. On the night of September 13, 1814, the British naval fleet bombarded the fort for hours. The sight of the American flag, our Star-Spangled Banner, still flying over the fort after the relentless assault was a powerful symbol of our resilience. I remember hearing about the battle and the inspiring sight of the flag still waving at dawn. It filled me with pride and renewed determination. It was a moment of hope in the midst of a war that had been filled with hardship and disappointment. The British had failed to capture Baltimore, and the tide began to turn in our favor. That same night, Francis Scott Key, a young lawyer, penned the words that would later become our national anthem, capturing the spirit of the moment. It was a symbol of the indomitable spirit of the American people and a reminder that we would not yield. Perhaps the most celebrated moment of the war came after the peace treaty had already been signed. The Treaty of Ghent, which ended the war, was signed in December 1814, but word of the treaty had not yet reached the battlefield. In January 1815, General Andrew Jackson led a ragtag American force to a stunning victory at the Battle of New Orleans, defeating a much larger British force. Though the battle occurred after the war had officially ended, it became a symbol of American military strength and national pride. General Jackson's victory at New Orleans lifted the spirits of a weary nation and gave the American people a much-needed sense of triumph. The victory at New Orleans was an ironic twist of fate. It came at a time when the war was already over, but it solidified our reputation as a resilient, independent nation. The British had been defeated, and we had survived the war with our sovereignty intact. The Treaty of Ghent, signed in December 1814, ended the war without addressing the issues that had caused it, namely, British interference with American trade and the impressment of our sailors. In many ways, the treaty returned things to the status quo. No territory changed hands, and the British made no significant concessions. Yet, in another sense, the treaty marked a victory for the United States. We had stood firm against the world's most powerful military, and we had endured. The war demonstrated that America would defend its sovereignty at all costs, and that our national pride was unshakable. For me, the war was both a trial and a triumph. We had faced enormous challenges, and at times it seemed like we might falter. But we endured, and through it all, I saw the strength and resilience of the American people. The War of 1812 was a defining moment for our young republic. It shaped our national identity and set the stage for the future. The aftermath of the war ushered in what would become known as the era of good feelings. The divisive political factions of the past began to fade, and a sense of national unity emerged. The Federalist Party, which had opposed the war, collapsed in the wake of the Hartford Convention and its perceived disloyalty. The Democratic Republicans emerged as the dominant political force, but even within our own ranks, divisions began to emerge over issues like economic policy and territorial expansion. While the war had been costly, it was also a turning point for the United States. It proved that we were capable of defending ourselves, that we had the resilience to face external threats, and that we could unify behind a common cause. The War of 1812 forged a new sense of national identity, and it helped to solidify the United States' place in the world. As I settled into my life after the presidency, I was often faced with the quiet but constant tension between my personal desire for peace and reflection and the ever-present pull of national issues. Montpelier, the place I had long considered home, offered me much-needed tranquility, yet I never ceased to think about the future of the republic that we had all worked so hard to establish. The republic had come a long way since the Revolution, but there were still deep and unresolved issues that would shape its future and test its very foundations. One of the most significant and disheartening aspects of my post-presidency years was witnessing the growing divide between the North and South, particularly regarding slavery. The very institution that had allowed me to maintain a certain way of life in Virginia was becoming a moral and political battleground. I had long wrestled with the complexities of slavery, as both an institution tied to the economy and a practice incompatible with the ideals of freedom and equality that I had spent my life championing. Though I had always believed that slavery should be gradually abolished, the reality of the South's dependence on it made such a policy difficult to implement. In my later years, I increasingly came to the conclusion that the continuation of slavery in the South was not only a moral stain on our nation, but a growing threat to the stability of the Union itself. I had hoped for a more gradual process of emancipation, believing that we needed to find a middle ground between the North and South, but the tensions over this issue were escalating rapidly. I became concerned that the failure to address the problem of slavery could eventually tear the nation apart. As one of the principal architects of the Constitution, I spent much of my retirement reflecting on its success and its shortcomings. The structure of the government, with its delicate system of checks and balances, had proven resilient, but I knew that the document's interpretation would continue to evolve over time. In particular, I spent considerable time thinking about the Bill of Rights. As one who had helped draft the original Constitution, I had not initially supported the inclusion of a Bill of Rights. I had believed that the Constitution itself was sufficient to protect individual liberties. Yet, I later came to appreciate the importance of the first 10 amendments. They had become a foundational part of our national identity, and they represented a commitment to safeguarding the freedoms that so many Americans had fought for. During my retirement, I frequently engaged in correspondence with political figures, reminding them of the importance of adhering to the principles of the Constitution. I urged the nation's leaders to be vigilant in defending the liberties we had enshrined in law, particularly as political factions continued to rise and challenge the delicate balance of power we had fought to create. Though I had retired from active politics, I was far from detached from national affairs. I kept a keen interest in the developments within the political landscape, particularly under the administration of my close friend, President James Monroe. The period that followed the War of 1812, often referred to as the era of good feelings, was marked by political harmony, but I knew that this unity would not last forever. I continued to correspond with Monroe, offering counsel on a range of matters. Monroe had a similar vision for the nation, and we both understood the importance of maintaining the Republican principles we had established, but we were also keenly aware of the growing sectionalism between the North and South, which could undermine the unity we had fought for. On the issue of internal improvements, such as infrastructure projects like roads and canals, I was somewhat more conservative than Monroe. I believe that the federal government should not overreach its authority and that such projects should be undertaken carefully and with respect for states' rights. This issue was part of the broader debate that would eventually lead to the development of political factions within the Democratic-Republican Party. Even in retirement, I remained deeply committed to the idea that education was essential to the survival of the American Republic. The University of Virginia, which Thomas Jefferson had founded, became one of my primary concerns. I had been involved in its early planning, and I continued to serve on its board of visitors, working to ensure that the institution remained a beacon of enlightenment and a place where young men could be trained to uphold the ideals of Republican government. Education, I firmly believed, was the bedrock of self-government. A republic could not endure unless its citizens were educated and capable of understanding the principles of liberty, justice, and the rule of law. This was a cause to which I dedicated much of my time in retirement, and I continued to advocate for the role of public education in shaping future generations. As I grew older, I became more reflective about my role in shaping the nation. I knew that my decisions, particularly regarding the War of 1812, had been controversial at the time, and I sometimes wondered whether I had done enough to avoid the conflict. The war had been costly, both in terms of human lives and economic stability, and though we had emerged victorious, I remained deeply concerned about the long-term consequences. One of my greatest personal regrets was not being able to resolve the issue of slavery. I had hoped that the nation would find a way to address it before it tore the Union apart, but the sectional differences were becoming more entrenched, and I feared the worst for the future. Nonetheless, I found comfort in knowing that the Constitution, which we had crafted with such care, had endured through so many trials. I could not know what the future held, but I was confident that the principles of liberty and self-government would continue to guide the American people, even through difficult times. In my final years, I took solace in my family and in the quiet life at Montpelier. Dolly and I spent many hours in the gardens of our home, enjoying the simplicity of nature and reflecting on the remarkable journey we had both taken. My thoughts often turned to the future of the nation, and I hoped that the republic we had fought for would endure. I passed away on June 28, 1836, at the age of 85, surrounded by friends and loved ones. In my passing, I left behind a nation that had grown and changed in ways that I had never fully imagined. My role in the creation of the Constitution was secure, and I hoped that future generations would continue to build upon the foundation we had laid. Though I was no longer present to guide the nation, I had faith that the ideals of liberty, democracy, and self-governance would continue to resonate. The American experiment had been tested, and though it was far from perfect, I believe that it held the potential to serve as a beacon for the world. James Madison's life is an extraordinary and profound chapter in the history of the United States. From his role as the father of the Constitution, shaping the foundational legal framework of the nation, to his presidency during the War of 1812, where he defended the sovereignty of the United States, he exemplified wisdom, vision, and a steadfast belief in democracy. He not only shaped the institutional structure of the U.S. government, but also laid the intellectual groundwork for the nation's commitment to freedom and justice. In the face of national crises and the challenges of war, Madison displayed the courage of a leader. He understood that presidential decisions impacted not just the present, but the future of the nation itself. His determination during the War of 1812, his political compromises, and his meticulous thinking in drafting the Constitution all demonstrated his unique blend of thought and action. After retiring, Madison returned to his home at Montpelier, where he quietly reflected on the future of the country. He remained engaged with national concerns, particularly in the realms of education, constitutional evolution, and the pressing issue of slavery. His thoughtful consideration of these matters was not just a personal endeavor. It was a demonstration of his continued sense of duty to the future of the Republic. Madison's commitment to education, his evolving views on slavery, and his constant reflection on the Constitution remain key aspects of his legacy. And Madison's life teaches us that building a nation requires more than courage and action. It requires foresight, wisdom, and a commitment to enduring principles. His legacy is not only found in the text of the Constitution or in his policy decisions, but in his unwavering pursuit of liberty, equality, and the ideals of Republican government. Through his actions, Madison proved that true leadership is not just about the triumphs one experiences, but about the strength shown during challenges and adversity. Today, as we look back on Madison's life, we are not merely remembering a historical figure. We are contemplating the very foundations of a nation. His ideas and decisions continue to shape the direction of the United States, and the principles of civic duty, the rule of law, and the importance of education still guide the nation forward. The story of James Madison is one of ideals and realities, responsibility and perseverance, challenges and wisdom. His life belongs not only to history, but to every individual who believes in the values of freedom and democracy. By reflecting on his contributions, we can better understand that the spirit of America, its founding ideals, requires individuals like Madison to protect and practice it.